Imagine for a moment that everything you thought you knew about Billy the Kid was only half the story. Imagine that there existed a rivalry so intense, so personal, that it forever changed the fate of the Old West. But history books chose to bury it in silence. This is the true story of the confrontation no one wants you to know about. The rivalry between Billy the Kid and Jesse Evans that shook the foundations of New Mexico territory like a silent earthquake. It was the year 1877, and in the dusty lands where the sun punished without mercy and the law was only a pretty word politicians pronounced in safe places, two young men were destined to meet in a deadly dance that would mark the beginning of a legend. But here comes what you were never told. They weren't enemies from the very start. In fact, they were something much more dangerous than enemies. They were partners. Billy the Kid, that boy with blue eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest heart or freeze it with terror in a matter of seconds, was only 17 when he met Jesse Evans. Jesse, 5 years older, and already a veteran in the art of surviving on society's margins, led a band of outlaws who terrorized Lincoln County with an efficiency that bordered on artistry. He was charismatic, intelligent, and absolutely ruthless when the situation required it. The first encounter between these two figures wasn't a duel at dawn like Hollywood movies have made us believe. It was in a filthy saloon in Silver City, during a stormy night when it seemed the very sky was collapsing onto the earth. Billy had just killed his first man in self-defense, an act that had marked him in a way he didn't fully understand. His hands still trembled slightly when Jesse approached his table. "I heard you've got a steady hand, kid," Jesse said, with that smile that had seduced decent young women and terrified tough men alike. Billy looked up, and in that moment, something changed in the air of the saloon. It was as if two forces of nature had recognized each other. Jesse saw in Billy something few possessed, that lethal mix of innocence and deadliness that can turn a teenager into a legend. Billy, for his part, saw in Jesse what he believed he could become, someone who had seized control of his own destiny in a world that gave no second chances. But here's the detail that would change everything. Jesse didn't just offer him a place in his gang. He offered something far more valuable for an orphan boy who had lost his mother just a few months earlier. He offered him a family. "We take care of our own, kid. In this world of wolves, only those who run in a pack survive." And Billy, with that desperate need to belong that all abandoned youths carry in their souls, accepted without hesitation. During those first weeks, riding together through the rocky canyons and endless plains of the territory, Jesse became something like the older brother Billy had never had. He taught him not only the tricks of the outlaw trade, but also life lessons no book could have provided. How to read a man's intentions by the way he moved his eyes, how to negotiate with corrupt traders who bought stolen cattle without asking questions, how to plan a robbery so that no one was hurt unnecessarily. Billy absorbed this knowledge with the eagerness of a bright student, but something inside him resisted the darker lessons Jesse tried to impart. When Jesse spoke of eliminating witnesses for safety, Billy felt an unease he couldn't explain. When Jesse laughed at the pleas of his victims, something inside the boy recoiled, as if he had touched hot iron. The breaking point came in the most unexpected way. During what should have been a routine job. It was a stagecoach robbery that, according to their informants, was carrying a considerable sum of money from a Santa Fe bank. What they didn't know was that it also carried a family of settlers, a man, his wife, and 2 small children moving west in search of a better life, bringing with them the savings of a lifetime of honest work. When they stopped the stagecoach in a narrow pass between 2 rocky hills, Everything went according to plan at first. The driver handed over the strongbox without resistance. The passengers stayed quiet and cooperative. But then Jesse looked at the family, and his expression changed. Billy knew that look. He had seen it before, and it always ended badly for someone. "We can't leave witnesses," Jesse murmured, his hand moving to his pistol. "Especially not these. Kids have good memories, and the man looks like the type who'd do anything for revenge." In that moment, Billy felt the world stop. He looked into the terrified eyes of the smallest girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and something stirred inside him. It was as if he could hear his mother, Catherine McCarty, whispering the prayers she used to say for him before tucking him in at night when he was little. "No," Billy said, stepping between Jesse and the family. His voice sounded strangely calm, but his blue eyes shone with a determination Jesse recognized and respected despite his surprise. "They didn't see our faces clearly. It was cloudy when we arrived." "Let them go, Jesse." The silence that followed was so heavy, it seemed to have physical weight. The other members of the gang exchanged nervous glances, sensing they were witnessing something that would change everything forever. Jesse studied Billy's face for what felt like an eternity, searching for signs of weakness or hesitation. But what he found was something completely different. A line in the sand that Billy had decided he would not cross, no matter the cost. "You're going soft, boy," Jesse finally said, but there was something in his tone, suggesting he wasn't entirely displeased with what he saw. "This is going to bring us trouble." Billy didn't answer, nor did he move from his position. For the first time since they'd met, the two young men looked at each other, not as partners or chosen brothers, but as potential adversaries. Jesse, who had survived so long precisely because he knew when to fight and when to retreat strategically, made a decision that revealed both his cunning and how fundamentally different he was from Billy. "Take your share of the money and get out, kid. But remember this, from today on, you're no longer part of my family, and I never forget an enemy." That night, as Billy rode alone under a starry sky toward a destiny he did not yet know, something fundamental had changed in him. It wasn't just that he had broken with Jesse Evans. It was that he had discovered something about himself he hadn't known existed. A moral line he wasn't willing to cross, no matter the consequences. At that moment, Billy the Kid stopped being just another outlaw and became something different, an outlaw with a code of honor. But Jesse Evans wasn't the kind of man who left accounts unsettled. In the weeks following their split, he began a systematic campaign to show Billy the consequences of defying his authority. When he learned that Billy had helped a Mexican widow protect her ranch from other bandits, Jesse burned the woman's crops in the middle of the night. When Billy defended an honest merchant from a group of violent drunks, Jesse made sure all the man's supplies mysteriously disappeared. It was a cruel, calculated psychological war, designed not only to demonstrate power, but also to teach Billy a lesson Jesse considered fundamental in the Old West. Survival depended on being tougher and more ruthless than everyone else. Compassion was a luxury only the dead could afford. But Jesse had underestimated something crucial about Billy the Kid's nature. Every act of cruelty aimed at innocent people didn't make Billy reconsider his stance. On the contrary, it strengthened his conviction that he had made the right choice in breaking away from his former mentor. More than that, he began to see his rivalry with Jesse as something bigger than a personal dispute. It had become a battle for the soul of the territory, between two completely different philosophies about how to live in a lawless world. The reputations of both men began to grow in distinct but parallel ways. Billy gained fame as a deadly but fair gunman, someone who never killed without reason and always protected the weak. Jesse, on the other hand, cultivated an image of ruthless efficiency, a leader who got what he wanted regardless of human cost. The people of the territory began to see them as symbols of different ways to survive on the frontier. Stories of their indirect encounters spread across the territory like wildfire in dry grass. In Roswell, Billy had stopped members of Jesse's gang from raping a young schoolteacher, facing 5 armed men alone in a shootout that left 2 dead and the rest fleeing for their lives. In Las Cruces, Jesse had hanged an informant who had given him false information. But everyone knew the real message was for Billy. This is what happens to those who betray me. Each action of one provoked a reaction from the other, creating an escalation of violence that turned Lincoln County into their personal battlefield. The local inhabitants learned to recognize the signs. When Billy was in the area, respectable families could sleep peacefully. But when Jesse Evans appeared, it was better to bolt the doors twice and pray for the storm to pass quickly. The final confrontation between them came in a way no one had foreseen. In the midst of the chaos that would become known as the Lincoln County War, Billy had allied himself with the small farmers and merchants who fought against the monopoly of Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, seeing in that cause an opportunity to fight for something greater than his own survival. Jesse, with his characteristic pragmatism, had sold his services to the side with more money, unconcerned with the moral implications of the conflict. It was July 1878, and tensions in the small town of Lincoln had reached boiling point. The heat was suffocating, the kind of heat that drives men to desperate decisions. Billy and his companions were entrenched in the house of Alexander McSween, while the forces of the Murphy-Dolan side, including Jesse Evans's gang, surrounded the building like wolves stalking wounded prey. For 3 endless days, gunfire echoed through the dusty streets of Lincoln, transforming the peaceful town into a war zone. Bullets whistled through the air like angry wasps, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the smoke of fires that began to break out across the city. It was the kind of chaos Jesse Evans had been waiting for, the perfect opportunity to eliminate Billy once and for all. In the midst of confusion, where any death could be explained as a casualty of war, it was on the 3rd night, when the flames had already begun to consume McSween's house and the situation had become desperate, that fate finally brought Billy and Jesse face to face. Billy had managed to escape through the back of the burning building, moving like a shadow through the backyards of neighboring houses. When Jesse emerged from the darkness like a ghost, pistol in hand, and that cruel smile Billy remembered so well. "End of the game, boy," Jesse said, his voice heavy with the satisfaction he had been nurturing for months. "You should have listened to me that day with the stagecoach. Now you're going to pay for every moment of humiliation you've caused me." But Billy, even knowing he was at a positional disadvantage, did not show a trace of fear. His blue eyes shone with that supernatural determination Jesse had learned to recognize and secretly admire. "Jesse," Billy replied with a calmness that contrasted dramatically with the chaos around them, "you were always quick to kill, but you never understood why it's worth dying. Today, you're going to learn the difference." The silence that followed these words was broken only by the crackle of the flames spreading through the city and the distant cries of other fighters lost in their own personal wars. At that moment, both men understood they had reached the point where words no longer had power. Everything came down to the speed of their hands, the accuracy of their aim, and perhaps most importantly, the strength of their convictions. Jesse represented pure survival. the immoral adaptation to a brutal world. Billy embodied the idea that even in the darkest places, a man could choose to hold on to some decency. What happened in the next few seconds was witnessed only by the full moon and the dancing shadows of the flames. Both men drew their weapons simultaneously, their movements flowing with the deadly grace of predators born for this moment. The sound of gunshots thundered through the night, momentarily drowning even the roar of the nearby blaze. Jesse Evans, the cold and calculating veteran, fell first. Billy's bullet had pierced his chest, finding his heart with a precision that would have been admirable if it were not so tragic. But Jesse's last bullet had also found its mark, striking Billy in the left shoulder and making him stagger backward. As Jesse died, his last thoughts were a strange mixture of rage and respect for the young man who had become a better man than he had ever managed to be. Billy, wounded but alive, remained by Jesse's body for several minutes that felt like hours. It was not triumph he felt, but a kind of silent mourning. He understood that Jesse, despite all his cruelty, had also been the product of brutal circumstances, a young man who had lost his humanity in the same barren lands that had nearly consumed Billy's own soul. In that moment of deadly stillness, surrounded by the chaos of a war that had consumed an entire city, Billy experienced something that would forever change his perspective on life and death. He realized that the true victory had not been surviving the confrontation, but preserving something human within himself throughout all those months of violence and survival. Jesse had been his teacher, his chosen brother, his greatest enemy. But more than all of that, he had been a mirror showing him what he could have become had he chosen a different path. The death of Jesse Evans marked the end of an era in the New Mexico territory, but also the beginning of a new phase in the life of Billy the Kid. Freed from the shadow of his greatest adversary, Billy began to question more deeply the path he had chosen. The seeds of awareness that had led him to protect that innocent family years earlier began to grow into something greater, the desire to find redemption, even if belated. During the months following the Lincoln County War, Billy tried several times to abandon the outlaw life. He even sought out Governor Lew Wallace to negotiate an amnesty in exchange for his testimony about the crimes committed during the conflict. It was a genuine attempt to rebuild his life on firmer ground, to honor his mother's memory, and perhaps to find the peace his troubled soul so desperately sought. Unfortunately, Billy's attempts to escape marginality were thwarted by corrupt politics and the conflicting interests of the territory's powerful men. Promises of amnesty were broken, agreements dishonored, and once again he was forced to flee to survive. But something had changed fundamentally in him after Jesse Evans's death. Violence had become for him a tool of last resort, no longer his first instinct. The stories of his final adventures reveal a man different from the impulsive youth who had joined Jesse's gang years before. Billy began to help poor settler families, protect widows of ranchers killed during the war, and even mediate conflicts between different groups without resorting to violence. It was as if the death of his greatest adversary had freed something noble in his nature, allowing his mother's positive influence to finally prevail over the bitter lessons of street life. During his last months of life, Billy developed a deep friendship with Pete Maxwell, a prosperous rancher who saw in the young outlaw not the criminal the press portrayed, but the man he could have been under different circumstances. Maxwell offered Billy not only shelter, but also the chance to work honestly on his ranch, real opportunity to start over, far from violence and constant persecution. It was in Maxwell's house, in the fateful early hours of July 14, 1881, that Billy the Kid finally met his destiny. Pat Garrett, the sheriff, who had become his most determined hunter, had tracked Billy to that last refuge. The irony of the situation was not lost. Billy died not in an epic shootout like the one that had ended Jesse Evans's life, but surprised in the darkness, without a chance to defend himself. Yet perhaps there was poetic justice in that silent death. Billy had spent the last years of his life trying to escape the violence that had defined him, seeking a way to exist beyond the reputation of a deadly gunslinger that Jesse Evans had helped to forge in him. His quiet death, far from the heat of battle, symbolized in some way the success of his quest for redemption, even though life had denied him the chance to fully live that transformation. The rivalry between Billy the Kid and Jesse Evans became more than just another story of the Old West. It transformed into a parable about choices, consequences, and the eternal possibility of redemption. Jesse Evans, the mentor turned mortal enemy, represented the path of conscious cruelty and the complete abandonment of any moral code. Billy the Kid, on the other hand, symbolized the constant struggle between our lower nature and the calls of our conscience towards something higher. In the saloons and ranches of the territory, the stories of their rivalry were told and retold, each version adding new details, sometimes true, other times born from the imagination of storytellers who understood they were preserving more than simple historical facts. They were transmitting a lesson about human nature and about how, even in the most desperate circumstances, there is always a choice to be made between good and evil. The legend of Billy the Kid continued to grow after his death, but it always carried within it the echo of his rivalry with Jesse Evans. Writers and historians recognize that to fully understand who Billy had become, it was necessary to understand what he had fought against, both externally and internally. Jesse Evans, even in death, continued serving as a dark mirror that reflected the choices Billy had made and the ones he might have made differently. In the decades that followed, when the Old West was transformed from brutal reality into romantic mythology, the story of the clash between Billy and Jesse evolved to represent something universal about the human condition. It became a metaphor about mentors who become obstacles, about young people who must choose between repeating the mistakes of their predecessors or forging new paths, about the eternal struggle between our destructive impulses and our potential for good. Today, when we face our own internal battles, when we attempted to follow paths we know are harmful, we can remember these two young men from the 19th century. We can choose to be like Jesse Evans, allowing life's hardships to harden our hearts until nothing human remains within us. Or we can choose the path of Billy the Kid, keeping alive the flame of conscience even in the most challenging circumstances, always seeking the possibility of redemption and growth. The forgotten rivalry between Billy the Kid and Jesse Evans reminds us that each of us carries within both the potential for destruction and for redemption. The difference lies in the choices we make each day, in every crucial moment when we are called to decide who we want to be. Their lives, intertwined by fate in the wild lands of the Old West, continue to resonate through the centuries as testimony that even in the most unlikely places, grace can bring about profound transformations in the human heart. This story invites us to a deep reflection on our own internal confrontations and the rivalries that shaped who we are today. If this journey through history touched your heart as much as it touched mine, I invite you to subscribe to our channel to continue exploring together these narratives that reveal eternal truths about the human condition. May you always find the strength to choose the light, even when the shadows seem to prevail.